Well, coming up this November, question 1 on the statewide ballot is a referendum on New England Clean Energy Connect. Central Maine Power's 145-mile line transmitting hydropower from Quebec to Lewiston. WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn today spoke to advocates on both sides of the question.
Proponents of the corridor say it's an important step toward remediating climate change, but opponents say it's a bad deal for Maine. Former state legislator Tom Saviello led the petition drive to get stopping the corridor on the ballot. He says the project is bad for the land and wildlife because a 53-mile path of trees will be cut down.
It's a clear cut. It's a gash right through the environment. It's as far as going from Augusta, so people can get a perspective, to Portland. Same distance mile-wise.
Corridor proponents like Clean Energy Matters attorney Newell Auger say Maine will lead the way on using hydropower for electricity instead of burning fossil fuels. 3 out-of-state energy companies with oil and gas-fired plants in Maine are funding the opposition.
The reason question 1 is on the ballot is because these fossil fuel companies are going to lose lots of money once the corridor is built. One
estimate forecasts their revenue loss will be $1 billion over 15 years. On the transmission line, Saviello argues the $258 million in economic benefits Central Maine Power promises over 40 years amounts to 41 cents a month per Mainer.
There's a lot more that Maine should have gotten out of this deal.
Auger counters Maine will get infrastructure and broadband investments and see 1,600 construction jobs.
It's a very good deal for Maine. It's a very good deal for the planet. And we'd be foolish to pass question 1.
The corridor question is the top issue on the ballot this November 2nd, and you can already request an absentee ballot now. In Portland, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
Maine voters may get to weigh in this November on the New England Clean Energy Connect transmission line. Central Maine Power is starting to build the line that will run from the Canadian border to Lewiston. As WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn explains, opponents seek a referendum to stop the project.
2/3 of the 140-mile corridor from Quebec to Lewiston would pass through areas where power lines already exist. The rest, closer to the Canadian border, would cut down trees for 50 miles in order to deliver electricity to the New England grid.
We do not want Maine to become an extension cord from Quebec to Massachusetts.
Sandy Howard led the petition drive to get a referendum to kill Central Maine Power's project on November's ballot, handing in 100,000 signatures, about 40,000 more than necessary.
Mainers won't stand down until their voices have finally been heard.
Opponents say CMP's Spanish parent company, Avangrid, and electricity provider Hydro-Quebec stand to earn billions with little benefit for Mainers.
Do we have the right to determine our own future, or are we relegated to be pawns of foreign corporations?
But CMP's Political Action Committee says the project is good for Maine's economy, providing an average of 1,600 construction jobs over the next 2.5 years.
There are people up working on this project that were laid off due to the coronavirus that have now gone back to work and are proud to have a job.
ACT says CMP will also pay $18 million a year in new property taxes, benefiting towns in the counties where the line will go.
Those are schools. Those are roads being paved. That is real revenue for these communities.
The referendum would require the state legislature to approve the project, already approved by public utility regulators, and prohibit similar projects in the same part of the state in the future. In Augusta, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
The Clean Energy Corridor is the biggest statewide issue on the November ballot. Now, question 1, a yes vote for that would cancel, and a no would then allow that project to continue. The corridor runs from Quebec to Lewiston, and tonight WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn looks at the environmental issues at stake.
This is the part of the corridor that its opponents want you to see, the most controversial third of the 145-mile project, the section where trees are being cut down. I'm standing roughly 20 miles into the 53-mile clear cut for the corridor. New power poles and power lines will be going right through here.
Well, the damage will really happen when they put the poles up. Some of the poles are 120 feet high.
For Somerset County resident Ed Buzzell, the project is simply a scar in the landscape he fears will be permanent.
The 53 miles is still salvageable. So,
if they stop now.
If they stop now.
He took me to this spot 35 miles from Maine's border with Canada. I thought this new path where they were clear-cutting trees was supposed to be about 50 or 54 feet wide. How wide is this?
Well, it's certainly not 54 feet wide, that's for sure. I've measured it with a tape measure, and it's 100 feet right here across.
Until this year, Buzzell owned Kennebec Kayak, a whitewater rafting guide and boat rental service in West Forks. Buzzell lives nearby on this property he discovered 27 years ago. Consider his view.
Well, you look out back of me here, and by putting a line straight across that mountain out there, that is not going to help our tourist industry, that's for sure.
Like many visitors to this area, he enjoys fishing, hunting, and exploring these woods.
I've seen them cutting right up over mountains, cutting right across some of our best brook trout fisheries that we have out there.
Power lines are already part of the landscape, and it's not hard to imagine what the corridor might look like when complete. 2/3 of the path already exists. The new metal poles being added are rusted brown to blend in more naturally.
This is a actively logged land, happens every year. It's responsible forestry, and we're just sort of, we're part of that.
Katie Yates is the project's Community Relations and Outreach Manager. She worked previously for Maine's Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and for the National Park Service.
We've made modifications to this project in order to limit the impact on wildlife and our natural resources. We have increased the buffers around cold water streams to reduce the impact on cold water fish species.
Yates says while 1,000 acres of forest is being cut down, 40,000 acres will be set aside as a preserve. She argues the project, carrying electricity generated by hydropower instead of burning fossil fuels, will mitigate climate change.
The worst thing that we could do for our natural resources and wildlife and fish and wildlife species in the state of Maine is nothing when it comes to climate change. Climate change is the #1 thing that will be affecting them.
Buzzell understands the need to reduce our collective carbon footprint, but he sees the corridor as fragmenting pristine forest and fears more energy infrastructure will follow.
If this goes through, anything can happen. I mean, wind towers, the whole land will be developed.
Everything that we're doing is a step in the right direction. I don't think everything is 100% perfect, right? I mean, if you look at how they create solar panels, that's not 100% green either. And I wouldn't work for this project if I didn't believe fully that this was the right step for Maine to move into the clean energy space.
A step for voters to decide. In West Forks, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
On the ballot next Tuesday, question 1 asks Mainers whether they want to cancel or keep New England Clean Energy Connect, Central Maine Power's 145-mile electricity corridor from Quebec to Lewiston. WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn went to the construction zone to report on the economic issues at stake.
Question 1 asks Maine voters whether CMP's corridor project should be allowed to proceed, but it's already underway. We watched workers prepare to embed a 70-foot power line pole into the earth.
So they're putting in a rebar cage, which will then have the concrete poured in, and the pole will bolt onto this so it can be freestanding.
The cage lifted and lowered for one of 830 planned poles, weaved into the 92-mile path of existing power lines, or a new 53-mile extension created by cutting down trees.
Each pole...
Jim Wright is the corridor's construction manager.
We want to hire more to get the work done.
Heavy machine operator Chris Hartsock is one of 600 construction workers already hired.
I've had to travel all over the country to kind of do this line of work, and this job helps me be home every night and with my family.
Construction is expected to last 2 to 3 years.
A half hour north of here.
Jason Durant is a forester, clearing trees and tapering vegetation in rural Somerset and Franklin counties.
There's a little convenience store that I go by every morning. I stop in there every morning. I'm buying stuff.
The project has committed to 80% of this workforce being state residents like Hartsock and Durant. And you're getting a good paycheck.
Absolutely, yes.
As good as you've ever gotten?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wright sees another payoff for 3 dozen corridor towns.
The communities that this line is going through, they're seeing, tax relief on their property taxes. That's a big one. You put the money back in everyone's pocket.
Lewiston, where the corridor terminates in a substation, is projected to collect the most, eventually $8 million a year. Some towns already receiving tens or hundreds of thousands in corridor property taxes. In West Forks, where the clear-cut path begins, many residents are saying no thanks.
It's all about money. The whole thing is about money.
Pete Dostey built the Hawk's Nest Lodge in West Forks, hosting 4 seasons of recreation, winter snowmobilers, spring fishermen, summer rafters, and fall hunters.
Bear, moose, deer, grouse, all of it. They're here for whatever's kicking around all year long.
His wife, Sarah, runs the lodge. Both oppose the corridor.
I get it. I love the idea of some renewable, sustainable energy, but it has to be done correctly. And just grabbing at straws and taking the first project from Quebec to Massachusetts, cutting through our woods without us, we're not even getting the power.
The hydropower generated in Canada will be used primarily by Massachusetts customers.
We want to reduce the CO2 footprint.
Maine Governor Janet Mills, who supports the project, says Maine will reap $258 million in benefits, the state buying some electricity at a discount, and some customers seeing rebates on CMP bills.
Janet Mills says it'll bring in $258 million, but that's over the course of 40 years, which is pennies per person per year.
The Dosteys also dislike how corridor profits will leave the state and country because CMP's parent company, Iberdrola, is in Spain.
To me, it is a foreign-owned company raping our backyard for their profit margin, not ours. We're getting very little out of this, if anything at all.
In Bingham, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
The debate over Central Maine Power's 145-mile corridor question 1 on Tuesday's ballot sometimes pits people in the outdoor adventure business on opposite sides. WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn reports on such a split in a picturesque corridor town.
Flatwater stuff here, and then
Kim Lyman and her family live on these 15 acres along the Kennebec River.
I look out my window every day and I know how lucky I am.
She's a rafting guide who opposes the corridor. Part of its lines will go under the river, upstream from her property.
And I know that we have to keep as much of this as possible for as many people as possible.
In Northern Outdoors.
Russell Walters is president of Northern Outdoors, a 4-season adventure company with a brewery and a lodge. Whitewater rafting is his key business, and he supports the corridor, one of just 3 of the 17 local adventure company owners who does.
For us, it's a climate issue. You know, we saw this summer, we saw drought, and we saw reduced water flows. That gets scary.
Walters also trusts Central Maine Power and believes in hydropower.
We've had a long-standing 40-year relationship with CMP. They've allowed us access to trails and infrastructure.
Lyman is most upset about the cutting down of trees to make room for power lines. The 53-mile clear-cut path starts nearby.
And I know a lot of people think, oh, Maine's, 90% wooded, but at one time so was the Amazon. And there's not much of that left either.
Walters isn't bothered that most of the new electricity connecting to the New England grid will be consumed in Massachusetts.
I've heard the issue of, it helps Massachusetts, doesn't help Maine. I'm not sure that the climate is concerned about borders.
A debate between nature lovers likely to continue after the referendum. In Caratunk, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
Speaking of election coverage, a big focal point of tomorrow's statewide ballot is question 1, the referendum on Central Maine Power's electricity transmission lines from Quebec to Lewiston. WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn is covering that campaign for us.
The No on Question 1 campaign favors CMP's corridor and says one of the reasons you should vote to save the project is that it currently employs 400 Mainers.
For those of you that want to protect Maine construction workers and keep us close to our families, please vote no on question 1 tomorrow.
Construction workers say their livelihood and Maine's renewable energy future is at stake.
It's a resume builder, and it's a stepping stone to the next career. And that's why I think it's important that we don't shut the door on this project.
Along the 145-mile corridor, 70 of the 830 planned poles are in the ground. In the 53-mile new section, more than half the trees removed. If the project is not interrupted or banned, CMP says, it could be done in 2 years.
And they're clear-cutting a huge section of Maine forest to bring it down into Massachusetts.
Yes on One says corridor costs are too high and benefits too low.
We know that this is a bad deal for Maine. It's bad for Maine's environment.
CMP argues connecting hydropower to the New England grid will mitigate climate change while delivering $18 million in annual property tax relief to corridor towns. In a $100 million campaign, CMP and its parent company spent more than double the Yes campaign, which was financed by out-of-state energy companies with oil and gas-fired power plants in Maine.
Certainly, we couldn't fight this fight alone. It's a David versus Goliath fight, and CMP and Hydro-Quebec stand to make billions of dollars off of the project.
If the Yes on One campaign wins, don't expect CMP to go away quietly. This battle would likely continue in the courts. In Augusta, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
A resounding defeat for Central Maine Power's Quebec to Lewiston electricity transmission corridor through the Maine woods. Yes on question 1 to ban the project won 59% of the statewide vote. That is with 98% of the precincts now counted. Tonight, WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn is following this story in our newsroom for us. So, Phil, CMP is not giving up this fight.
That's right, Steve, not giving it up and in a way ratcheting it up. This afternoon, CMP's parent company, Avangrid, filed this 27-page lawsuit in Maine Superior Court seeking a preliminary injunction, arguing the vote yesterday cannot be lawfully applied retroactively to stop an approved billion-dollar project already underway. The new lawsuit argues the company has a vested right to complete and operate the project, with new poles in the ground, half of the new 53-mile path cleared, and $350 million spent.
We did follow every rule in a very open and transparent process.
New England Clean Energy Connect President Thorne Dickinson has worked on the project for a decade.
We had a 3.5-year regulatory process. The conclusion of every one of those permitting agencies was that this was good for the environment and good for Maine's economy.
Dickinson and the lawsuit call the referendum outcome unconstitutional for violating the separation of powers.
Well, essentially you have the referendum process, which goes through the legislative branch, that's then making conclusions associated with decisions that have already been evaluated in the executive and the judicial branch.
Mainers who live closest to the corridor voted most forcefully to stop it. 64% for yes in Somerset County and 69% in Franklin.
I voted against the corridor. I just don't think it benefits Maine enough.
I think it's important that we protect our lands and not put it out to corporations.
It's all for the benefit of the people in Massachusetts, and they're paying none of the price.
Dickinson blames the defeat in part on what he calls distortions by the opposition campaign, financed by out-of-state fossil fuel companies.
I think the biggest misinformation that there's no climate impact associated with this project.
Regulators who had approved the project believe the electricity generated by Canadian hydropower would reduce planet-warming carbon gases by 3 million tons a year. That's the equivalent of removing 700,000 cars from the road. Live in the newsroom, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
Pressure is building on Maine's Department of Environmental Protection and Governor Janet Mills from opponents of the CMP corridor. They want state officials to pull the plug on the project after its defeat at the polls on Tuesday. WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn is here with some late-breaking information for us. Phil.
Megan, since question 1 was called Tuesday night, there's been constant legal wrangling by both sides. Just a short time ago, a spokesman from Governor Mills told me she hopes the courts will act in a timely manner to provide clarity and resolve the matter so we can put this controversy to rest. 3 days after winning the referendum, 59% to 41%, corridor opponents say it's time for Central Maine Power to admit defeat.
CMP is trying to thwart the will of Maine voters, and it's an overwhelming vote against them, and they're thumbing their noses at Maine people.
Natural Resources Council of Maine scientist Nick Bennett rejects the company's argument that it has a vested interest in completing the project after spending $350 million.
They have proceeded and are continuing to proceed entirely under their own risk. The fact that they have spent money on this corridor is their mistake. It should stop now.
The same sentiment today from anti-corridor state legislators, empowered by the referendum to grant approval on such projects in the future.
Yet somehow CMP has failed to hear our message. Maybe it hasn't reached CMP's corporate overlords in Spain yet.
It's also time for Governor Mills to honor the vote of the people and demand the company halt the destruction.
Late today, Maine Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner Melanie Loisem said the referendum result could affect some or all of the project. She announced a public hearing November 22nd to consider suspending the project and staying its license. The company filed a lawsuit this week to nullify the referendum as unconstitutional.
Of course we're going to defend that investment.
Corridor President and CEO Thorne Dickinson saying today, "We believe in this project and will continue to advocate for it because it is good for our state both environmentally and economically." The DEP commissioner says she hopes to issue a decision quickly after the hearing 17 days from now, but she did not say when. November 22nd is also the deadline for the Secretary of State to certify election results, putting the referendum on track to become law in early January. Live in the studio, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
The Maine Department of Environmental Protection is holding a public hearing right now to consider whether to revoke permission for Central Maine Power's corridor through western Maine.
Yeah, this all follows that referendum 3 weeks ago, and 59% of Maine voters cast ballots to stop the corridor. News 8's Phil Hirschkorn is monitoring the hearing for us tonight with the latest. Phil?
Well, Steve and Megan, the all-day hearing over Zoom was on the calendar before Governor Janet Mills asked CMP last Friday to halt construction, and CMP agreed to do so temporarily.
Stop the destructive corridor now.
What part of no do you not understand?
Like corridor opponents who rallied outside Department of Environmental headquarters last week, witnesses said democracy is on the line.
The voices of Mainers have finally spoken and said, enough is enough, shut it down.
Shall the will of the people of our state prevail, or will dense, obtuse legalisms be employed to negate the people's will in favor of financial and political expediencies?
Central Maine Power asked DEP to take no action before the referendum becomes law December 19th or before courts rule on its motion to block the referendum as unconstitutional.
To apply the initiative retroactively to the project would deprive NECC of its vested rights. It also would make any development in the state vulnerable to after-the-fact changes to the law, chilling future economic development in Maine.
The company also advanced a new argument that the construction ban is vague.
What the term Upper Kennebec region in the initiative means, and thus where construction is banned under the initiative, is entirely unclear.
Maine guide Ed Buzzell, who took us to the clear-cut path last month, showed commissioners new photos of trees cut down after the referendum. The Natural Resources Council of Maine, which asked for this hearing, pressed the president of the Chamber of Commerce, who supports the project, if CMP's actions are unprecedented.
Can you name one where permits were preliminarily granted, like this permit here, but the permit was under appeal, and the developer nonetheless went ahead and built?
None comes to mind.
After today's hearing ends, we don't know when the DEP commissioner, a Mills appointee, will issue her decision, just that it will be soon. Live in the studio, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
3 weeks after Election Day, another nail in the coffin for Central Maine Power's corridor through western Maine. State environmental regulators suspended the license for the project last night, and WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn is here with reaction. Phil.
Well, Megan, Maine Department of Environmental Protection took only 24 hours after Monday's day-long hearing to pull the plug on the corridor, but the agency left itself some wiggle room pending court action. Among opponents who pressed DEP to suspend the license were Friends of the Boundary Mountains, which are near Maine's border with Canada, where the hydropower corridor begins. The group's president is Robert Weingarten.
We need to leave some space for wildlife and for nature. And I think that's what motivates me.
Residents of the construction counties see little economic benefit and a lot of environmental damage. No CMP corridor treasurer, Darrell Wood, is an avid outdoorsman.
If you're going to put a transmission corridor through the heart of what I consider the last contiguous forest in the east, you better have a good reason, and it better be a really good deal for Maine.
Accepting the referendum, 59% voting against the corridor, now certified by the Secretary of State and Governor, DEP Commissioner Melanie Loisem ruled, when the people of Maine exercise their legislative power through a citizen initiative, there is a general presumption of constitutional validity. Monday's DEP hearing saw these pictures, snapped 10 days after Election Day, showing how tree cutting had continued.
That was why a suspension or a stay was so important.
DEP's deputy commissioner told me today the new law will go into effect unless a court says otherwise, which is why CMP is suing to overturn the result. Corridor President Thorne Dickinson saying, "We remain committed to the construction of the corridor and the significant reduction of more than 3 million metric tons of carbon emissions it will bring to Maine and New England annually."
I don't feel like our job is done.
Maine's Attorney General will be defending the referendum. Oral arguments over CMP's motion to invalidate it are scheduled in Maine Business Court on December 15th, just 4 days before the construction ban becomes law. But construction for now has stopped. Live in the studio, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
Central Maine Power is trying to undo the results of the referendum banning construction of the electricity transmission corridor through the western Maine woods. News 8's Phil Hirschkorn watched that virtual hearing today and is here now to describe the arguments for and against. Phil?
Steve, 59% of Maine voters rejected the 145-mile corridor on November 2nd, but today the company tried to resurrect it during a 3-hour Zoom hearing in Maine Business and Consumer Court.
This proceeding is a public proceeding.
Judge Michael Duddy listened to what might be Central Maine Power's last chance to save the corridor.
Its clearing and cutting is essentially done. We're talking high 90% completed.
Its attorney argued the company has vested rights, $450 million spent on construction with lawful permits.
That if this injunction is not granted and there is an interruption of construction for even a few months, there's a likelihood the project will fail, and that's irreparable harm.
The Maine Chamber of Commerce warned stopping the corridor could have a chilling effect on investment in Maine. And an energy consumer group reprised another campaign argument for expanding markets for renewable hydropower that would travel the corridor.
In a nutshell, we're going to need way more transmission capacity to deal with the climate crisis. We need to convert our cars and heaters and many other things to renewable electric energy.
But an assistant attorney general countered protecting the environment is in the state's interest, and CMP can't acquire rights against the will of the people.
By overwhelmingly voting in favor of the referendum, the public articulated very plainly what its interest is.
An attorney for a rival energy company with a natural gas-fired power plant in Maine said CMP knew its project was being challenged. After all, the referendum petition was submitted just 3 days after construction began.
They clearly, therefore, could have waited until after the vote on the referendum. The fact that they chose not to was done at their own risk and does not count to vesting rights.
Both sides agree without an injunction, the referendum becomes law on December 19th. This Sunday, 4 days from now, the judge promises a decision tomorrow or Friday. Live in the studio, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.
A judge has denied CMP's motion that would have blocked the referendum that stopped the transmission corridor through western Maine. WMTW News 8's Phil Hirschkorn is live in studio with the decision and reaction. Phil.
Well, Megan, State Judge Michael Duddy denied the Central Maine Power request to block the referendum from becoming law on December 19th, Sunday, 30 days after the election was certified. Duddy rejected every company argument, concluding affirming the referendum is in the public interest. Construction has already stopped on the 145-mile corridor that would transmit electricity generated by renewable hydropower from Canada to the New England grid. CMP argued it had vested rights due to its investments so far, that it would suffer irreparable harm from the stoppage, and that the referendum is unconstitutional because it usurps power of executive agencies that approve the permits. The judge completely disagreed. Corridor opponents like the National Resources Council of Maine say this is a big win for Maine people who voted overwhelmingly, 59%, to terminate the CMP corridor, and that the CMP corridor was a bad deal for Maine. But CMP says New England Clean Energy Connect project is good for Maine, and we remain committed to this project and its many benefits and look forward to restarting construction as soon as we are able. So CMP's lawsuit will continue even as the ban takes effect. Maine's Department of Environmental Protection tells me the company's permit stays suspended. Live in the studio, Phil Hirschkorn, WMTW News 8.